Welcome everyone. My name is Jean Oy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our session. I am the director of the Stanford China program under the Asia-Pacific Research Center. And in cooperation with the Hoover Project, we are very delighted today to bring you a talk by David Shambaugh talking about his new book, China's Leaders from Mao to Now. But before I begin, I just want to give you a heads up on an event that I think many of you will be interested in, and that is the Distinguished Paying Lecture this coming Tuesday by Professor Jiang from Peking University. And he's going to be talking about, his title of his talk is Avoiding Disaster, U.S.-China Relations. And that will be this coming Tuesday from 4:15 to 5:45 here in Encina Hall in the Oxenberg room, which is behind the elevator. So if you haven't registered, please do so. Now let me get back to today's session. I am particularly personally pleased to introduce David Shambaugh, who I've known for a long time. David is a fellow member of something called the Michigan Mafia. And this is a term used to describe the numerous students of Michael Oxenberg, who trained us at the University of Michigan. And this mafia has gone on, and I think for quite a while has sort of dominated the study of Chinese politics. He sort of put people in strategic places around the world. I also wanted to say that Michael Oxenberg, who then went on and was very important in establishing U.S.-China relations, serving in the Carter administration, Mike had a very important impact on all of his students, of course. But I just think that it's important to say that I think David, in particular, was very much sort of influenced by Mike in the sense that he served as his staff when Mike was at the National Security Council under the during the Carter administration. And it was during that time when he discovered David and encouraged him to go on to graduate school at Michigan. And David did, and I think the rest is history. He went on to a very distinguished career. Some of you may remember or know that David went on to serve as the editor of the China Quarterly. He did a fabulous job for about almost 10 years as the editor of that, while he was at also, what is it called in reader in Chinese politics at the University of London's SOAS. And then he was lured back to the United States, back to George Washington, and that's where he's been, and he now is the Gaston Seeger Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science, and International Affairs. He is also the director of the China Policy Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW. David, I must say, I am very envious. He has either written or edited something like 30 books. And the last few years during COVID has been amazingly productive for him. If I count correctly, he's had something like 3 books during this since 2020. So, I don't know, this was like one really, I think, silver lining in that period. And he's written, among his many books, I think the 2 that are sort of some of my favorites are the one on the Chinese Communist Party, and called China's Communist Party, Atrophy and Adaptation, and also one on the military. But rather than going through his many works, today we've asked David to come here to talk about one of his newer works, China's Leaders from Mao to Now, where he looks at the 5 paramount leaders who have really shaped China's fate and fortunes, as well as the Chinese Communist Party. And given the events, and this of course would be Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Jintao, and of course Xi Jinping. And given the events of the last couple of a few weeks, months, I guess, since the 20th Party Congress, this couldn't be more timely. And something that's even more timely, obviously we did not know this would happen, but one of the leaders that he talks about, Jiang Zemin, passed away this Wednesday. And amazingly, on that very same day, David's article on Jiang Zemin was published online in Foreign Affairs, titled China's Underestimated Leader, The Legacy of Jiang Zemin. So, in any case, I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions for him during Q&A. And with that, I'll be turning over to David. And we've asked him to talk about 30 minutes or so on the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Tiffert, who is a historian of modern China and one of the co-chairs of Hoover's project on China's global sharp power. And let me just say that we will be taking questions and we will be going beyond 5 o'clock, probably at least going to 5:15, if not a few minutes later. And I've been told that we will be taking questions not only from the audience here live, but we also have people on Zoom. So those of you on Zoom who want to ask a question, please put them in the Q&A box and we will curate those questions and then Glenn will pose them to Larry. And so with that, I want to have you help me welcome David.
All books by their covers, right? So, Christmas is coming. Thank you very much, Jean, for that generous introduction, and to the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center in the China program, and to the Hoover Institution and the Sharp Power Project, Global Sharp Power Project, I should say, for the joint invitation to return to Stanford. It's been a number of years since I've been here, but always a pleasure. And I'm really, really glad to be back and to see some old friends in the audience. And I wish to thank Larry Diamond, who's sitting behind you, for initiating the invitation. We were speaking in the summer, actually before COVID. Because when COVID is over, David, we have to get you to Stanford. Well, here we are. We made it happen. Thank you very much. I would also like to just begin by giving a brief shout out to my close friend and colleague, Professor Andrew Walder, who is there, shrinking violet that he is, Andy and I also share a history dating back to the University of Michigan PhD days, and he's been a true friend and intellectual stimulus to me throughout my own career. We share in common, amongst other things, that this, some might say, rather perverse interest in the anatomy and longevity of communist, Leninist style political systems. I've learned a great deal from Andy's writings about them. Andy was also kind enough to read and critique a couple of the draft chapters for this book. So thank you for that, Andy. And I just also have to say, Jean has already said that we go back 4 decades to the University of Michigan, where we were classmates under Michael Oxenberg, and one cannot be here at Stanford without remembering Mike. He's everywhere. He's conference rooms, he's programs, everything's named after him. It's all very appropriate, but hardly a day passes where I don't think about him and miss him and the outsized impact he had on my own personal life and career. And I know that he's a very happy man right now because Michigan just destroyed Ohio State.
Thank you.
So really, it's a great pleasure to be here. Time is very short, so I'm going to, let's get to it, so that we can leave as much possible time for discussion and Q&A about this. So the book, as Jean has indicated, is about the 5 principal leaders since the establishment of the PRC to the present: Mao, Deng, Jiang, Hu, and Xi. It also, of course, deals with many of the other senior leaders in those different periods. So it's a kind of one-stop shop on leadership politics, as it were. So I think the best way to approach this is to kind of give you snapshots of how I assess each leader in the book. Each leader has his own chapter. There's an introductory chapter actually on how to think, or at least how I think about Chinese leadership politics, the political culture of Chinese leadership politics. And a long discussion there of contextual and cultural and institutional factors in which they all have to operate. And then I have a concluding chapter where I contrast their leadership styles with each other, trying to draw out similarities and differences. So those are sort of bookends, you might say, in the volume. And in between, you have these 5 individual chapters on each. And each chapter I give that leader a kind of descriptor, subtitle for each of the leaders. So let's start with Mao, who I describe as a populist tyrant, because he repeatedly tried to tap into what today we call populism, appealing to the downtrodden, the dispossessed, the disaffected, and aggrieved elements of society, the rural peasantry in particular. Mao was also a deeply anti-elitist politician who repeatedly appealed straight to the so-called masses. He had an innate, almost voluntarist faith in the masses and their ability to exercise collective agency and change deeply rooted cultural practices, norms, and institutions. So that's the populist part of it. Mao may have been a Marxist, by the way, but he was not particularly a Leninist when it came to utilizing the party or state institutions, particularly after 1956. He had deep distrust, as we all know, of institutions and bureaucracies, and he repeatedly sought to mobilize society against the party state, not the least of which was during the Cultural Revolution. Mao was also very much a revolutionary, obviously, but I argue in the book of the Trotskyite variety. He believed in perpetual revolution and the export of it. He was not a Stalinist type of revolutionary who wanted to consolidate the revolution at home in one country, as Stalin used to say before he and Trotsky had a big argument and falling out over that issue. Anyway, now the tyrant part obviously comes because I see Mao as one of the great, probably the wrong adjective to use, most noteworthy despots and tyrants of the 20th century in the world, in the league of Hitler and Stalin, in terms of deaths caused, at least. Between 40 and 50 million Chinese died as a direct result of his policies, and countless other millions were persecuted. So these two elements, a leader who cultivated the masses on one hand, yet stigmatized and terrorized several segments of the population, on the other, stand in contrast and somewhat in contradiction. In Mao, and I can only commend all of you to read Andy Walder's book, Mao's China. Mao's lasting legacy in my view, mixed, but generally very negative. On the one hand, he is indeed recognized by the Chinese as the father of the Republic, is seen as the leader to restore China's unity and dignity, as a philosopher, statesman. Yet his rules also was defined by extreme unpredictability, unrelenting, and extraordinary repression and brutality. And he was personally responsible for causing great domestic chaos and retarding China's development. So I don't give him very high marks. Next, Deng Xiaoping. Of course, I'm not telling this audience things that you don't already know, I think. I'll spend a bit more time on Jiang, Hu, and Xi. Deng Xiaoping I describe in the book as a pragmatic Leninist. Of course, we think he was a pragmatist in his policies, mainly economic and foreign policies, but also very, we'll call them experimental, not necessarily pragmatic when it came to political reform and social reform. But his philosophy, if you will, is well summarized in his famous statement, doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. Now, the Leninist descriptor, so pragmatism on the one hand, the Leninist descriptor refers to his emphasis on rebuilding in the wreckage of the Cultural Revolution, the institutional apparatus of the party state and ruling through that institutional apparatus at all levels. Deng is to be remembered primarily for having overturned the deleterious effects of the Maoist era, of course, having launched the country on so-called reform and opening, and having stimulated many of the processes that has resulted in China becoming a global power today. Deng's accomplishments were significant in several realms, but I would just note particularly foreign policy, establishing diplomatic relations with the United States. I was fortunate enough, having worked for Professor Oxenberg on the NSC for a year and a half in 77, 78, to have been on the South Lawn of the White House when Deng came to meet with Carter. I met him 3 times myself on that visit. Here on the, but normalization of the U.S. Signature achievement for Deng, renormalizing ties with the Soviet Union, I would note as an achievement after the Sino-Soviet split and estrangement of several decades, and opening relations with China's Asian neighbors and many European countries. So foreign policy, I think, he's remembered for obviously economic reform and some other things domestically, but I think foreign policy is one of his greatest achievements. Biggest black mark in his legacy, of course, June 4th, 1989, undoubtedly. Lasting stain on his legacy. So Deng is often seen by and described by other scholars as sort of through the anti-Mao, the antithesis of Mao. Many ways he was. Unlike Mao, Deng did not rule through intimidation or coercion. I would argue he didn't terrorize the population through draconian repression, as Mao did. 1989 Tiananmen being the exception to that statement. Nor did Deng lead the nation by great personal charisma or charm, although he certainly possessed prestige and commanded respect as the paramount leader. Nor did ideology serve as much of a tool for Deng's leadership. Deng was the quintessential organization man. He was just a quintessential Leninist. And throughout his career, he worked in and believed in working through, as I say, bureaucratic structures. So, and he did much to build them in the first place in the 1950s when he was the general secretary of the party, and then subsequently when he came to power in the 1980s. Deng was also, however, alert to the inevitable tendency of bureaucracies to develop and pursue their own set of interests and missions, thus resisting initiatives from above and tending to ossify from within. He often exhibited intolerance of bureaucratic inertia and incompetence. He gave many dismissive speeches about bloated bureaucracies, including the military. He championed meritocracy, streamlining the bloated bureaucracy. And these streamlining efforts were actually aimed at strengthening the bureaucracy and making it more competent and enhancing the party state's capacities rather than dismantling them. It was Mao who attacked these institutions, but it was Deng who, as I say, rebuilt them and ruled through them. There was also a certain collegiality and, I would argue, and decisiveness and activeness in Deng's work style that was absent in Mao's. Certainly after 1961, as Mao disengaged. Deng sought consensus when possible and was certainly more tolerant of dissenting opinions. In general, Deng protected his colleagues while Mao attacked them. There were other differences between the two, which I think I'll skip. But it's interesting the differences about their views of the West and the outside world. Mao had no contact with the outside world, went to the Soviet Union twice in his life. Deng spent, I think, 3 years, 2.5, 3 years in France. As a teenager, I traveled a lot after that abroad, and had a certain envy of the West, I would argue, not suspiciousness of the West, as Mao did. Deng was no less nationalistic than Mao. Both were socialized with similar views of the need for a strong and dignified China, but Deng sought the West as an ally in this quest, whereas Mao was much more distrustful. So on balance, I give Deng much better marks than Mao. He rectified many of the wrongs that Mao had left and perpetuated on the country, and he set the country on the path to becoming the world power that it has become today. Now let's turn to the recently departed Jiang Zemin. So I describe him, my descriptor for Jiang Zemin, I call him a bureaucratic politician. I think he really broke the mold of Chinese leaders. What do I mean by that? Well, when he was thrust into power in the aftermath of June 4th, 1989, he was catapulted from Shanghai. He had an almost non-existent power base. He had no real political patrons of any significance. Wang Daohan was his lifelong political patron, but that's not exactly a significant patron in broader terms compared to other elites. He had no ties to the main party factions. He had no real relations with the military, and he had no geographic base other than Shanghai. So he was dismissed by many at the time as a very likely Hua Guofeng-like transitional figure who would not last very long, be their caretaker until he was muscled aside and somebody else was put in his place. Jiang ended up ruling for 13 years, 1989 to 2002, longer than Deng Xiaoping. How? That is the puzzle. And I explained it in the chapter in the book and then the obituary in Foreign Affairs this week, which have been in preparation actually for several months. They approached me in June, I think it was, this summer, to write it. And we've been working on it over the last several months, waiting for the moment. So it wasn't like he died and all of a sudden I wrote it. We fine-tuned it just last week. Anyway, so I call him a bureaucratic politician. He drew on his background as a bureaucrat, and he turned it to his political advantage. Now, China may be a one-party dictatorship, it is, but it still has different constituencies throughout the country. Geographic, factional, institutional, patronage-based, networks, and bureaucratic. And I argue in the book that Jiang overcame his initial weaknesses by cultivating various bureaucratic constituencies in the party, in the government, the military, in the internal security services, and other institutional organs. And in each, what he did was to adopt their respective institutional preferences and made them his own, thus effectively co-opting them. He didn't tell them what to do, he listened, and he have a lot of information in the chapter about what he did in the first 3 years, where he went, which institutions he visited, what speeches he gave, and he effectively did what all good politicians in any political system will do, which is to adopt your constituents' preferences, call them your own, and then shower them with resources, right? It's a very effective, very astute, strategically and tactical way, because he had no power base, but he knew how to navigate the state council industrial bureaucracies very well. He spent his entire career in the ministries of machine building, the ministries of electronics, and the auto sector. This is a man who was a party member, obviously, but he didn't hold a party position until 1985, when he became the party secretary of the Ministry of Electronics. So he came up through a different system, and I think that he turned that to his advantage. In retrospect, he well outperformed those original expectations. He became much more substantive than he was originally given credit for. He was dismissed at the outset as being a so-called flower pot for having like a nice ornament who had no functional purpose. So he lasted, he had staying power. And he also had accomplishments, I think. His tenure was notable for having overcome the international condemnation and isolation following the June 4th massacre, for stabilizing ties with the United States in the aftermath of the June 4th massacre and the Taiwan Straits crises in 95-96, and broadening China's foreign relations. He presided over the return of Hong Kong in 1997 to Chinese rule. He implemented a series of very sensitive, high-level personnel changes in the leadership at the 14th Party Congress. Not easy to do, including getting rid of the so-called Yang family village, Yang Shankun, Yang Baibing clique in the military, but others too. He oversaw the longest stretch of sustained high-level economic growth rates in the country's history. He raised the standard of living, and he set the People's Liberation Army on a path of serious modernization. And showered resources on the PLA. Just look at the budgets from 89 onwards. And in politics, he instituted, I argue, a series of stealthy but very significant political reforms, not the least of which was the so-called three represents thesis, an innovative concept for bringing the commercial class into and under the control of the party. But the book goes into some detail about how Jiang Zemin's right-hand man, Zheng Qinghong. In my view, one thing those who may be surprised from this book, I see Zheng Qinghong as one of the key figures in recent Chinese politics over the last 2-3 decades. This is a very underappreciated person. Any PhD students out there looking for dissertation topics? Number 1, Wang Huning. Number 2, Zheng Qinghong. But seriously, Zheng Qinghong was tasked by Jiang and by the party with overseeing the post-mortem analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was a 13-year effort 1991, when the Soviet Union imploded, did not conclude until the fourth plenum of the 16th Party Congress in September 2004. 13 years. Very meticulous, very detailed, and it was the conclusions were announced at the fourth plenum. Go back and read the communique if you haven't, and read the speech by Zhang Qinghong the following day, explaining what the lessons were for China of the collapse. So this is absolutely, that exercise is absolutely central to CCP politics to this day. Why? Because there were two schools that emerged inside the party in this analysis. A predominant school at the time that argued that the Soviet Union atrophied over time and became a sclerotic, overly bureaucratized, unresponsive institution. Wasn't responsive to its society, wasn't responsive to itself, was isolated from the world. We don't have time to go into all the failings of the Soviet Union and Soviet Communist Party here, but this school of analysis said that it was not Gorbachev, repeat, not Gorbachev, that brought the Soviet Union down. It was Stalin. And that ever since Stalin, the Soviet Union, all the way through the long Brezhnev era and the Chernenko era, except for the brief and drop-off period, had been in steady decline, and the party itself had become a kind of sclerotic entity. Therefore, lessons to be learned for China: don't allow yourself to become a sclerotic entity. Be responsive to constituencies, including the masses. Have a flexible, not a dogmatic ideology. Have checks and balances within the system. Have relative tolerance and opening for dissent, for media, for permit civil society, including foreign NGOs, to operate inside your society. And monitor it carefully, because any of those things, if it begins to get a little bit out of control, pull it back. So school number one inside the CCP, called controlled opening or managed opening. That was the predominant school that Zhang Qinghong led, Jiang Zemin bought into, Hu Jintao bought into. And that lasted from not just the fourth plenum, they'd been implementing it all the way from 1995 all the way through to 2009, 15 years. And then the second school began to make its appearance. It was a school that believed that it all had to do with Gorbachev, and that you should not ever start down the path of reform and opening, perestroika and glasnost. It will cascade out of your control. They believe the second school, the so-called managing opening, is a non sequitur. It will cascade out of control and you will fall from power. That's what happened to the Soviet Communist Party. Guess who's representative of school number two? Xi Jinping. So there has been this tension between these two schools of thought within the intra-party. The book I presented here at Stanford in 2008 goes into this. Still, it's very relevant. So anyway, long story short, under Jiang Zemin, they instituted a number of those reforms. Hu Jintao took them over and kept them going, in essence. So let's turn then to Hu Jintao. And some other things I was going to say about Jiang Zemin's persona and personality. He was definitely a different type of leader in terms of his gregariousness, his ego, his dress. I mean, this is not your classic communist apparatchik. And he, as I argued in the Foreign Affairs article, he was very well educated and very cultured. This is a man who studied in American schools, essentially, American curricula in Nanjing and Shanghai. Learned to speak English pretty early on, studied foreign literatures, foreign history. This is an intellectual. Jiang Zemin was an intellectual, okay? And he was a talented musician. He could play the air hoop quite competently, the piano quite competently. Or Condi Rice on the piano, but he's but he loved to sing. You know, everything from Elvis Presley love songs to opera. So he was a really different. He would go off subject when he was having meetings with foreigners frequently. Tom Finger can testify to this. He did not follow his so-called talking points. He was very spontaneous, and he was very frustrating for his aides because they had prepared him to say all kinds of things to the counterpart, and he would just ignore them and talk for 45 minutes, and then the meeting would be concluded, and the aides would then slip pieces of paper or slip the talking points literally to the foreigners counterpart, say, this is what President John just said. So this is a very unscripted, different type of leader, but I argue in the book that he lasted as long as he did. He didn't want to go, by the way, but he respected the retirement norms in the end, and he stepped down from his positions. So Hu Jintao, I describe him in the book as a technocratic apparatchik. So let me unpack each of those a little bit. Obviously, he's a technocrat due to his training in engineering at Tsinghua and subsequent work in the hydroelectric industry in Gansu province, where he spent several years. And then, even in Gansu, but particularly after Gansu, he spent his entire career in the inter-party apparatus, mainly in the youth league side. He became the head of the youth league for a while, but worked in the ideology and propaganda sector for a long time. This guy is the kind of quintessential party insider. But he was personally, just the opposite of Jiang Zemin. He was just totally bland figure. Just so, I don't know, just
lifeless.
He had no apparent persona. I remember the pun at the time, who's who? Does the guy have a personality or not? I think it's a little unfair. He was just a very disciplined individual. That's what happens to these ganbu. They move up through the system. You learn discipline. When he left office, he and Wen Jiabao, the premier, were accused of having overseen so-called 10 lost years. I'm not so sure that that's a fair assessment. And I think with the passage of time, we can talk about what may or may not have happened to him at the 20th Party Congress. But, I think if you look at his 10 years in power, there were a number of important policy initiatives launched and a number of things accomplished on his and Wen Jiabao's watch, notably in social policy, party reform, and foreign policy. And, he oversaw a marked, a distinct shift, I should say, in the policy emphasis of the Jiang Zemin era, which was focused on growth at all costs and on the coast in particular, in Shanghai in particular, towards the inland. A new emphasis on the kind of geographical prioritization of inland provinces and developing the West initiative on issues of social equality, social justice, improving basic living standards, social services, environmental protection, poverty alleviation, reducing the burdens on farmers, which was more Wen Jiabao's policy than Hu's, public safety, anti-corruption, job retraining, and other public goods. So this is a very commendable and progressive agenda. Go back and read his speeches in his first 5-year term. Problem was, the second 5-year term, they just faltered. They were not implemented. The various reasons for that, but I think the major reason is that Hu Jintao himself had no bureaucratic power base, and he didn't do what Jiang Zemin had done, which is to cultivate bureaucratic constituencies. You're going to implement policy, you need the bureaucracies to do it. They didn't respect him. The military didn't respect him. The industrial sector didn't respect him. The S&T sector didn't respect him. He didn't lead. And at the end of his term, there were widespread critiques inside of China. I was living there in 2009-10. I heard them myself. We have no leader, a vacuum at the top. So the progressive agenda that he and Wen Jiabao set out faltered in the second term. And that Susan Shirk's new book, by the way, is absolutely superb on this. 2009 is the key year, not 2012 when Xi comes to power. It's 2009 when Hu Jintao becomes a complete lame duck and the Xi faction begins to, if you will, assert itself. But I think with more retrospect and the passage of time, Hu Jintao's historical reputation might be burnished for the better. He can credibly claim at the end of his decade in power that he'd maintained social and political stability, he'd overseen considerable economic growth, paid attention to the less fortunate sectors of society, protected national security, and continued military modernization, and enhanced China's position and reputation in the world, particularly with the global south. Fundamental reorientation of Chinese foreign policy under Hu Jintao, away from the west to the global south. So, by these accomplishments, by any measure, can be considered successful. He kept China's development train on the tracks. He kept the party in power, the country out of war. He opened extensive exchanges with Taiwan, remember. There were no cross-strait relations before Hu Jintao and Ma Ying-jeou. And he enhanced the nation's standing in the world. All metrics, I think, so maybe over time, he will be seen better. Okay, lastly, this brings us to the current guy. I describe Xi Jinping in the book as a modern emperor. That's the descriptor I use, because he rules China during modern times in ways reminiscent of some of China's historical emperors, all powerful, regal, aloof, feared, sycophantically revered, in singular control of all organs of state and military power, a believer in the country's greatness, a promoter of the imperial past, intolerant of insubordination and dissent, and a proponent of ethical behavior, and a setter of official ideological doctrine, interpreter of the past, just like all emperors did, and visionary of the future. So maybe it's a stretched metaphor, but it's the one I decided to use for him when I wrote the book. Now, we've all had 10 years of watching Xi Jinping. And I know you're kind of interested maybe in talking about the events of the last few days with respect to the COVID protests. But I would note that I think Xi Jinping is a very divisive figure inside of China. He's certainly divisive outside of China. No, he's not so divisive outside of China. I don't see much support for him anywhere in the world. Full stop. He has damaged China's reputation to such an extreme extent and ruined so many productive relationships with foreign countries. I can't think of a single foreign country where things are going well. His, quote, best and bosom friend, Vladimir, unquote, that's what Xi Jinping called Putin about a year ago. Jinping isn't the most emotional kind of guy. He said, I have my best and bosom friend in President Putin. Maybe that relationship's going well. I'm not so sure that's going well either. So, but inside of China, I believe that he's a very divisive figure amongst urbanites, intellectuals, ethnic groups, even in the party. So his report card after 10 years in power, in my view, is mixed. It's not actually all negative. He did address many of the weaknesses in the system that were evident at the end of the Hu Jintao period, clearly evident. To foreign analysts, certainly were to me and others outside who studied the CCP, and they were evident inside of China. There was a long 2-paragraph section in the 20th Party report where he says, when I came to power 10 years ago, blah, 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 this is the situation we had. And here we are today, 10 years later, taking all of the credit for having put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Well, he's not incorrect on where things were 10 years ago. Corruption was rampant and out of control. Gini coefficient highest ever, inequality, crime, moral vacuum, lack of ideology, no party discipline, military not being very efficient with the resources that was being given. A lot of things were not going well. So in several spheres in the first 5 years, he put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So maybe we can put that in the accomplishment column, but at a huge cost. So let me just conclude on where I see China today under his rule. I describe China today as a neo-totalitarian system, and him as a neo-totalitarian dictator. Now, political scientists in the room will immediately dust off in their head the classic works of Hannah Arendt and Friedrich and Brzezinski and others on classic totalitarianism. Go back and look at the characteristics of those systems, by which I largely have in mind Nazi Germany, certainly Stan Imperial Japan, other fascist systems, and the Soviet Union. You just tick down the boxes today. But many of those elements are present in today's China. Sycophantic ruler, cult of personality, institutionalized purge, what Brzezinski wrote in his book in 1956 called The Permanent Purge, where the Soviet system had institutionalized this, has been institutionalized in China. These anti-corruption purges of 7, 8, 9 years ago were more than anti-corruption attacks. Anyway, they've been institutionalized. So he rules through intimidation and fear. There may not be the terror factor. But yes, if you study Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, terror, killing was a key element. You don't see that in Xi Jinping's China. Yes, we have the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and we have zero tolerance for any dissent of any type in the entire society. I'll finish on this point. The CCP itself has become, under Xi Jinping, this is the irony of the situation, because of the analysis the CCP did of the Soviet collapse. How to avoid becoming a sclerotic, atrophying, inflexible, dogmatic regime. That was the challenge. Well, here we are. That is exactly the kind of regime that Xi Jinping has created. So in the short term, you might say his first 5 years, he strengthened the party. There were all these things going wrong, yes. But in the second 5 years, the train has gone off the tracks, and he has weakened it, I think, in the medium and longer term. The CCP today is, as I say, kind of like a robotic machine, like a military, where orders are given from the commander-in-chief, everybody salutes and says, yes, sir. And we're supposed to implement it. This is not the kind of party that Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Jintao, and even Mao in some of his moments in the 50s and in Yunnan had in mind. This is a Stalinist, neo-totalitarian party, in my view. It's ideologically dogmatic, one-man rule, the control bureaucracies, what Susan Shirk likes to call the control bureaucracies, mainly internal security and propaganda, are in control. Everything has been securitized. If you read the 20th Party Congress report, the term 国家安全 or just 安全 is used no fewer than 77 times, second only to Baja, which still comes top, development, but everything. And the report identifies now 16 categories of national security, each category of which has subcategories. That is an increase of 4 from when Xi Jinping rolled out the National Security Commission in 2012. So now up to 16, everything is securitized. Political security, cultural security. Tell me what that is. Right. So long story short, this is a neo-totalitarian system that is exhibiting extreme insecurity. This is the paradox of the issue. The kind of what the Chinese call Wai Ying Nei Ran, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. This is an insecure, soft system, afraid of its own shadow. But it's don't underestimate it. Don't underestimate what it's going to do to the COVID demos. It's a xenophobic, hyper-nationalistic system. It's totally intolerant of civil society. It's totally hostile to the West. And any kind of creativity or freedoms. It's not pragmatic in economic policy. You know, it's that's where I feel Xi Jinping has led the party and his country. We'll all have to just stay tuned. You know, the reason I chose the subtitle for this book, I could have said from Mao to Xi, but no, Xi's not going to be there forever. Okay, so I thought maybe I'll do a new edition. Question is when and who comes next. Who Jintao may have come. No pun intended, but we're at a kind of one sense is that we're at something of an inflection point in that country as a system. So I'll stop there, Jean. I'm sorry I've run over time, but
No, that was fabulous. For that, I mean, this is really exciting and very, very timely and useful. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Glenn, who's going to take care of the Q&A, and you can perhaps
Have a seat, David.
sit down and
Yeah.
have a discussion.
Thank you so much. With all of the amazing talent in the room, I certainly don't want to speak too long. I want to turn it over to Q&A, but I think it might be useful for us to begin with a few framing questions. And as the presider and the host of the meeting, I'd like to give Jean Oy an opportunity to pose a question before I have a couple for David.
As I said, I thought it was really very, very useful sort of to compare. And one of the questions I have is there's been a claim, and most, I think probably Kevin Rudd has been talking about that Xi is really a sort of ideological man. I want to know what your reaction to that is. Sort of how really a true believer is he, or is his ideology more a reason why, or the excuse, let's say, for really strengthening the party?
well, good question. I agree with Kevin in this regard and others. I agree with him on a managed competition paradigm for U.S.-China relations, by the way. We can get into that if anybody's interested. But no, Xi Jinping is a true believer. He's a real ideologue. He's a real Marxist. He actually has read Das Kapital and the Theses on Feuerbach and all this other nonsense. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. All these classic works of Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism, and so on. No, he has set up this extraordinary system of Marxist academies throughout the country, and has subjected party and citizens to an unrelenting barrage of it. So, question for me with regard to ideology in China always is it a determining factor of policy decisions, or is it a post hoc rationalizing factor for policy decisions taken on other more pragmatic grounds? This guy is a dogmatist. He is an a priori ideologue of economic China. This is a man who is, like Jiang Zemin, in fact, a product of the planned economy. His frame of economic reference is Soviet. And that's the normal state the market, the private sector, innovative companies, these should all be adjacent at best in his view. So no, he unfortunately, this is a big mistake on his part. And China's paying consequences for it already. So I think Kevin is spot on.
Did you want to follow up?
Well, I do, just because it's so interesting to useful to sort of compare to the other leaders. So then in these terms, would you say that Jiang Zemin or Deng, would you say they were less ideological? They're sort of believers?
Yeah.
Or equal?
Yes, no, I make the case in the Deng chapter that he was the post hoc rationalizing kind of the way he treated ideology. He made decisions on pragmatic bases. He didn't abandon ideology.
Right.
He couldn't. It's a socialist country. It's a communist party. It's a question of how you use ideology to rationalize and explain to the public and the people in the system what you're doing. For Deng, very much, that was one big break. Jintao actually was more ideological. But Jiang, I don't think ideology mattered much to Jiang. Jiang is a bureaucrat. He's an industrial bureaucrat. And I don't think he spent a whole lot of time reading Marx. Hu Jintao had, however, throughout his career. I'm not sure it interfered with his policy decisions, though. This is the first ideologue we've had since Mao, real true ideologue. Well, look what happened to China under that guy.
I mean, in some sense, it's Xi Jinping is the worst of all worlds. He's an ideologue like Mao, but he's a hardcore Leninist too, right? And he combines the excesses of both of those in a sort of synthesis, which I think is terribly damaging. As a historian, I want to invite you to step back from the five leaders profile and think about the changing nature and demands of leadership in China as China has modernized, as the economy has changed, as the consciousness of its people has changed, as technology has changed. Xi Jinping's presence on video screens in a way, on a daily basis in a way that now never could be. He was radio broadcast and they did not see his face. He was not a part of it. He was not on their smartphones in a way that Xi Jinping is. Right. And so what does leadership in China, how has that changed over time? And how have the individuals that you profile responded to that or changed the nature of what it means to be general secretary and president of China?
Very good question, Glenn. In the first chapter, it's one of the things I wrestle with, and I have to thank my friend and colleague Harry Harding for introducing me to the leadership literature, which is rather significant body of literature. I had read in graduate school myself, James McGregor Burns, so I went back and dusted that off, transformational versus transactional leaders. And I tried to, every one of these five leaders, I try to apply that simple framework to. But I read beyond McGregor Burns. And in the concluding chapter, I have I'm going to take the time now, some things to say about that. I saw, but your question is about leadership today. What is the nature of the system? I think you put your finger on the key issue. What kind of leader is needed at this level of development today? That's where I think Jiang Zemin was so brilliant. He understood at his time in power how to lead. Today we might call it leading from behind, right? The Jiang Zemin characteristics. He just embraced and empowered the bureaucracies. He let them lead. Smart, real smart. He was not a transformational leader. He didn't stand up and give inspiring speeches. He had no charisma. He didn't lead the country. When we think of leadership, we think of sort of the American style politician, right? In any system. I think that's not necessarily the way to look at leaders. Different types of leaders lead differently in different types of systems. Xi Jinping is a Leninist leader, if you will. He's leading through these neo-totalitarian devices. But that's out of sync with the way China is today. Totally out of sync, I think. We need a kind of a leader that has Jiang Zemin characteristics where he empowers, embraces, tolerates, and gives scope and space to different actors in the society. Not wide open, not, but controlled opening, which was the major school, I'll remind you, of the Soviet collapse. So they have gone off track. They had a track from 95 to 2009. They were on track. And, well, Xi Jinping would argue it led to a crisis in 2009. And there needed to be an Ibasho, a strong leader. But I think that there's a contradiction today between a very sophisticated society with knowledge and aspirations that have never been this way before, and a 1950s style totalitarian leader. It's just like two worlds that could not be more different. And I just don't see that tension, how that tension is going to be resolved. But I can tell you there are a lot of people inside that system who do not support what he has been doing for the last 10 years. And if he went tomorrow, slipped in the bathtub, hit by a bus, or overthrown in a coup d'etat, ladies and gentlemen, I want to just put that on the table. This is not an impossibility in systems like this. We can open our morning newspaper someday, Xi Jinping out. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not predicting it. And that's why he spends so much time on the internal security services. He rotates his personal bodyguard unit monthly, changes them out.
Yeah. So you mentioned this turn towards securitization as a reflection of his profound regime insecurity and personal insecurity. Do you think it's relevant in this respect that he is really the first generation leader who has not himself who does not himself have the legitimacy of having participated in the revolution, or was not directly blessed by someone who did? And so his standing, China no longer, they can't lean on the revolution, they can't lean on 10% economic growth. So where is his legitimacy coming from?
Well, he thinks it comes from being the Hongard guy, being a child of the revolution.
Right.
And he claims bona fides being part of the revolution because of dad. And that generation, that is the kind of, look at what he does. He's trying to take his country back to literally to Yan'an, to Nanshan, to the shame and humiliation exhibition in the National Museum. It's just a throwback. It's out of sync, totally out of sync with the 21st century.
And it's a red aristocracy now, right? Which is antithetical to the revolution in its own way, right? So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience and also our online audience as well. So please pose in the Q&A, but I see Tom Finger first.
Thank you, David. I thought it was terrific. I'd like to pick up on Gwen's question and where you began with the context matters. That with the arguably exception of Mao, these leaders didn't pick themselves. That, using the Marxist jargon, identifying the principal contradiction, getting a leadership to address is where it's supposed to work. And arguably it has worked. That, how do you see the relationship between behavior of these leaders during the period of their rule coming from personality, your descriptors here, and how much of it is they got picked to do a job, and that's the job they're doing. They did it well or they did it badly, but that they were picked to be the man for a particular time to achieve a particular set of goals that are shared by some segment of the elite, perhaps momentarily or transitorily a majority in some sense. But like you, I see Xi as a scapegoat in waiting. That when you need to protect the party, he goes. But how do you see the relationship between the principal contradiction and the people who have been put in charge of dealing with that?
Oh, Comrade Finger, you have been reading your dialectics. That's good. No,
Signable.
joking aside, the big question you asked, Tom, I see each of these leaders, in effect, having been products of the system in their own ways. But I don't see any of them breaking the mold of the system per se. Every one of them. Jiang Zemin, he came out of the industrial planned economy, bureaucratic system. Jintao came out of the inner party, and Xi Jinping came out of this red aristocracy. That's a system in itself, in a sense. The families, the first generation elite. Deng was, he's a product of the system too. Just the system went off the rails in 1960, and we didn't get a chance till 78 to kind of open the file drawer and say, where were we now before we were so rudely interrupted with that thing called the Cultural Revolution, the socialist education movement. So that's the interesting thing about leadership. Mind you, most systems, I'll just make a quick observation of these types, these communist Leninist style systems, it's very rare for personality and agency really is a strong independent variable. Gorbachev was really an exception to the rule. If you study Gorbachev's provincial career, like when Paul were here, he'd tell you his time in the oblast, he was just a classic apparatchik. There's nothing to distinguish him. I've studied Xi Jinping's time 17 years in the provinces. There is nothing distinguishable that he did, not a single thing in 17 years that stands out. It's really striking. He was very good at keeping his head down. He managed to dodge a couple of major anti-corruption scandals in Fujian. But then all of a sudden he gets to the top and a persona emerges, an agency emerges. And so he breaks the mold in a sense of these others were all kind of products of the system. So he's a transformational leader in the Greco Burns terminology, for better or for worse. But these sorts of systems, they incubate. That's the whole point to them. I have an article I just published on the cadre training academies in China, all 7,500 of them. This is a massive institutionalized training system, the Ganbu Shuyan and the Deng Xiaoping. They're producing robots. That's the whole point of these systems. You're not supposed to stand out. Individuality, agency, personas, that's not allowed in a Leninist system. So it's very unusual when you get a Gorbachev.
I want to turn to our online audience, and in particular, Alice Miller, who has posed a question.
Oh.
Alice would like you to turn your scoring machine on and give the 5 leaders that you've profiled the 70-30 treatment that the historical revolution gave Mao. Who is 70 or 60 or 50% correct, and who's conversely at fault by how much?
Very good. Well, Comrade Miller, we're going to see each other tomorrow, and I look forward to getting your assessments. But just to try and respond, I do say in the book that of course we know Deng said Mao was 70% correct and 30% incorrect. I flipped that. I think Mao was 30% correct at best or good. And I think, as I said, he just wrought havoc on the country. Deng, I would give it's not a 30-70 Sanchi dichotomy. I would give Deng a kind of 90-10 positive versus negative. And the negative's not just 10 and 1. There were other inflation, price control, a lot of stuff that happened under Deng was actually really on Zhao Ziyang's plate. Somebody had written on, and I commend all of you, Julian Gewertz's new book, Never Look Back, about this period in the 80s. Anyway, I think Deng on balance, 90% good, 10% errors. Jiang Zemin, having just passed away, probably 75-25. At the end of my discussion about Jiang, I ticked off a number of issues about corruption, inequality, unbalanced growth, corruption, and disenfranchisement, and that, you know, are real negatives. So maybe 25% negative, but I would give Jiang Zemin pretty good marks overall, 75. Hu Jintao, 50-50. And because he started off with a good agenda, but it just fell apart in the second 5 years, never went anywhere. And maybe you can't say those were failings, they were just, well, they were failings because they weren't implemented, and it showed his and Wen Xiaobao's weaknesses. They didn't have any Trinley, those guys, you know? It takes Trinley to implement policy. But 50-50 Alice for Hu Jintao. Xi Jinping, the jury is still out, so we can't pass historical judgment on him yet, comrade. But I would say he's probably 35% positive, 65% negative for what he's done domestically. He's 95% negative in foreign relations. He has really damaged China's international reputation and standing in relationships everywhere in the world, including Africa.
Andy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question, David. I was really struck. I read your foreign affairs piece. You said a little bit of that here about Jiang Zemin, and I was really struck at your portrayal of him. I think it's also in the New York Times obituary that he's really well educated and quite talented and open-minded. You didn't say much in that vein about Xi Jinping, but a lot of things that people who have met him, dealt with him, have written outside of China, and a lot of people that I know within China portray him as a dim bulb and poorly educated.
Right.
Do you buy that? Because after all, we, as you point out, we underestimated Jiang Zemin when he was in power.
Great question, Andy. He's not a well-educated individual, first of all. We know that his background, he was a sent-down youth, you know, because of the Cultural Revolution. He was admitted to Tsinghua in 1974. Funny thing, just one person in the entire Shanxi province admitted to Tsinghua University. You read Tsinghua University, happened to be, so he went there. Turns out he was not, I do write about, it's very hard to find information on this, but I dug up whatever I could. He wasn't a very good student, struggled with math and science, which if you're at Tsinghua is not exactly something you should struggle with. He preferred to run track. He was very fast. And he apparently liked to read literature. And then he got his BA in effect. We all know he has a supposed PhD in agricultural mechanization, dissertation on agricultural mechanization, which I think has been pretty well proven to have been plagiarized. In fact, there's a scholar in England who has found the original documents from another Chinese scholar and found Xi Jinping's dissertation were verbatim plagiarism. He gets a PhD for it. He wouldn't be the first Chinese, you know, who did that or anywhere else. But so, is he an intellectual? You know, I've always been amused when he was traveling pre-COVID, and he'd go to Europe, he'd go to Bruges, he'd go to Brussels, he'd go to Germany, and he'd read these speeches about, oh, I was just reading, you know, Heidegger the other day, and and I learned the following, and you know, so these speeches are obviously written for him. He had no clue who Heidegger is. So this is not an intellectual. This is a very narrowly intellectually trained person. Never studied abroad, speaks no foreign languages. So I wouldn't put him in, I wouldn't call him an intellectual. In fact, of these 5, only Jiang Zemin is an intellectual. I'm not even sure I'd call him. Mao comes the closest, actually, after Jiang.
We're coming to a close, but there's going to be a reception afterwards for those who are here in person, and I'm sure we can continue the conversation there. I just want to give Peter Michelson the last question.
Yeah, I just wonder, in your rating for Xi Jinping, you gave a 35% tentatively. What did he do well? I'm still not clear on what he actually did well.
Oh, he
Was it?
put a stop to corruption. That's a good 20% right there.
Well, wasn't that a weapon as well?
Well, I suggested he used that as a political weapon, but given where it was early in the decade, that I would put on the accomplishment list. There's a lot of side effects of that, of course. The 3.5 million who have been prosecuted. But not just those 3.5 million, it's their families and extended families who are stigmatized by all this. So he's sent, this is part of the rule through intimidation and fear tactic. So he took the anti-corruption campaign and it's had other consequences. But I think that it had to be dealt with, and whether it was dealt with in the appropriate way, I'm not going to say that, but it's come way down. Innovation, made in China 2025, the whole innovation focus, smart, real smart. How they're going about it is not so smart. The decoupling approach, the dual circulation approach, and we can do it on our own approach. But the tech-led development strategy, I give him credit for. We still haven't figured out about common prosperity, whether there's any group others in the green gene. But military modernization, not passing value judgments on any of these things, except corruption perhaps, but military modernization, boy, this is a serious PLA today under his watch. He's invested real time and real resources on it. So I don't know, those come to mind, but the 65 or 70% on the other side, easier to describe.
Before handing back to Jean on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I want to thank you very much, David, for an excellent talk and really stimulating discussion. Thank
Definitely, it was wonderful, it's very, very great. So in any case, I just also want to invite the audience out for a reception wine and cheese, I believe. So please, we'll continue the discussion, and thank you, David, that was really good.